Dear chosen ones, how many times have you sat in silence, not because you didn't know what was going on, but because you knew exactly what was happening? How many rooms did you walk into fully aware, only to let others believe you were naive, unaware, or too soft to matter? The truth is, you were never oblivious. You were observing. You didn't miss the signs. They missed the fact that you were the sign. And now that you've stopped playing dumb, they're panicking, because when a chosen one stops pretending, the whole illusion begins to collapse. They thought you were blind while you were just blinking slow. They thought they were outsmarting you while you were tracking every move in silence. And now the consequences are here, not because you fought back with words, but because you let the truth rise on its own. So, how many of their games required your silence to survive? How many of their lies depended on you staying quiet just a little longer? And how many of their fake alliances were held together only by the hope that you'd never open your mouth? You weren't behind. You were ahead, letting them dig their own graves. You weren't confused. You were collecting karma. You were the mirror they couldn't escape. And the longer you let them believe you were small, the more dangerous you became. Before we go deeper, I just want to take a moment to thank every single one of you who's been supporting this message through super thanks. Your generosity fuels this platform and pushes this light even further into the world. And whether you've donated or not, please know you are appreciated. Just showing up, listening, and walking this path with me is a blessing that doesn't go unnoticed. Every share, every comment, every moment you've locked in, it means something. And if you're feeling led to give, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. But either way, your presence is more than enough. So now we begin. If you've ever been the one who stayed quiet on purpose, if you've ever watched people spin lies while thinking you were asleep, if you've ever let others build fake power on the assumption that you were clueless, this is your message. You didn't stay silent because you were scared. You stayed silent because the correction didn't need a warning. You knew that time would speak for you, and now it is, loudly, precisely, without mercy. So drop 777 in the comments if you're done pretending, done shrinking, done letting people mistake your clarity for confusion. When you do, you're not just claiming your truth. You're spreading this frequency to every chosen one who's still sitting quietly in the fire, waiting for the moment to rise. This message isn't hype, it's alignment, it's activation. It's the echo of every time you swallowed your discernment just to keep the room from breaking. But now, the silence is over. Let's get into it, layer by layer, mask by mask. Stay locked in, chosen one, because now that they finally realized, it's time they feel every consequence. God's chosen ones, they finally realized you were just playing dumb. Now they want to cry. Number 1, they thought you were clueless. You were calculating. Chosen one, they looked at your silence and thought it meant stupidity. They misread your stillness as confusion. But have you ever noticed how people reveal the most when they think you're not paying attention? How many times have you sat in rooms where your name was twisted into mockery, yet you didn't flinch, not because you were blind, but because you were strategic? They thought they had the upper hand. They thought your quiet meant you didn't catch on. But the truth is, you were calculating every move. You were letting the story unfold. You weren't confused. You were documenting. You weren't slow. You were patient. You didn't expose them, because wisdom knows some people need to be given enough rope to hang themselves. How many people have mistaken your calm for weakness simply because they've never seen your storm? They saw you nod and smile, and they mistook it for ignorance. But what they didn't understand was that you were taking mental notes. You were watching the show from the front row, seeing every plot twist unfold. You weren't acting lost. You were letting their own delusion do the talking. You were never the fool in the story. You were just letting them believe they were ahead. And now they're terrified, because suddenly it's clicking. You always knew. Every fake smile, every sarcastic jab, every little alliance made behind your back, they're realizing you saw all of it, and you never said a word. But why didn't you? Why didn't you defend yourself back then? Because chosen ones understand timing. For there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. Ecclesiastes 3:1. There's a time to speak and there's a time to stay silent. And your silence, it was sacred. It was precise. It was divine intelligence in action. You weren't clueless. You were the storm dressed like morning mist. Soft, quiet, but absolutely capable of rearranging everything once it moved. Think about Martin Luther King Jr. They underestimated him because he chose peace over aggression, but it was that very stillness, that deep spiritual clarity that shifted an entire nation. He didn't scream. He stood still, and his silence disrupted generations of injustice. Have you ever noticed how people panic, not when you react, but when you don't? They kept poking, kept provoking, waiting for you to explode so they could call you unstable. But you never gave them the satisfaction. You didn't fight their fire with more fire. You let it burn out on its own. And now the smoke has cleared, and guess what's left? Their own shame. While they were laughing behind your back, you were building. While they were playing games, you were studying the board. While they were clapping for each other's lies, you were getting closer to truth. That's why they're shaking now. Because nothing haunts a manipulator more than the realization that the person they tried to gaslight saw through it all and never said a word. The Lord is my defender. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Psalm 118 verse 6. God was training you in the silence. Every time you held your tongue, heaven was sharpening your discernment. Every time you swallowed your pride and didn't lash out, you were building spiritual muscle. You didn't need to expose them. You let the fruit of their actions do it. Albert Einstein once said, "The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing." But here's what people forget. Einstein himself was once labeled slow and mentally challenged as a child. They mocked him because he wasn't loud, flashy, or ordinary, but he was calculating. And when the time came, he didn't just speak, he rewrote science itself. Just like you're about to rewrite the story they tried to bury you in. How many times did you feel tempted to speak, to fight, to call them out, and still chose silence? That wasn't weakness, that was leadership. You knew what they didn't. Alignment never panics, destiny doesn't rush. And storms, they don't knock, they just arrive. You were the storm that gave no warning. And now they're choking on the very stillness they mocked. Your silence wasn't absence, it was observation. You were watching, learning, discerning, storing up divine timing like spiritual currency. Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. Proverbs 17:28. They saw your humility and called it fear. They saw your grace and labeled it insecurity. But now that the masks are off, now that truth is screaming through every crack in the facade, they're beginning to understand. You weren't dumb. You were just never desperate to be seen. Consider the story of Oprah Winfrey. Rejected, humiliated, told she wasn't fit for TV. She didn't argue. She didn't retaliate. She watched. She learned. And when her moment came, she built a platform so massive that those who once rejected her couldn't ignore her anymore. Her silence wasn't her end, it was her strategy. Isn't it funny how the ones who underestimated you now seek your validation? They counted you out while you were counting the cost. They dismissed you while you were defining your mission. But here's what they didn't know. The chosen don't retaliate, they ascend. We don't clap back, we elevate. And now your glow is blinding the very people who laughed at your shadows. He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Psalm 23, verse 5. This is your banquet season. The same mouths that mocked you will now be silenced by your success. The same hands that tried to block your path are now applauding your breakthrough. But don't let their regret shake your peace. You earned this. You earned every silent victory, every unseen battle, every whispered prayer when your voice was shaking. Nikola Tesla was once called insane for his ideas. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flamboyant, he was calculating, and though they dismissed him in life, his inventions now power the world. That's the legacy of the chosen ones. We outlive the mockery. Do you realize how powerful it is to let the truth reveal itself without you forcing it? You never needed to prove anything, you only needed to stay aligned. And now you are the outcome they can't deny, the reality they can't undo, the truth they can't suppress. You gave them silence, and they interpreted it as stupidity. But now they're realizing your silence was their mirror. Let this be the final word to your spirit today. You were never clueless. You were composed. You were never behind. You were appointed. And the next time the enemy tries to guilt you with, maybe you should have spoken up, remind yourself, you didn't hold your peace out of fear. You held it out of wisdom. And wisdom always wins. So let them cry. Let them unravel. Let them rehearse apologies they'll never say. The truth is already echoing louder than any confession could. You didn't clap back. You didn't post receipts. You didn't scream your worth. You let God handle it. And now the harvest is speaking. And you, dear chosen one, are walking in the brilliance of everything they once said you couldn't have. Number 2, they laughed at the one watching. Now they're begging the one awakening. Chosen one, do you remember the silence they mocked? The way they chuckled in rooms you left behind? The way they mistook your retreat as a retreat from power rather than a return to purpose? They laughed at your stillness because they thought stillness meant death, but they never understood your silence wasn't the end. It was the incubation. They danced on what they thought was your grave, not knowing it was your cocoon. They mistook your withdrawal as collapse, your quiet as defeat, your peace as surrender. But while they performed for attention, you prepared for ascension. How many people have mistaken your silence for surrender simply because they don't know what divine transformation sounds like? They didn't understand that when a chosen one steps back, it's not because they've broken, it's because they're becoming. You weren't folding, you were forming. You weren't crushed, you were cocooned. You didn't vanish, you were preparing to be unveiled. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. That's what they missed. You weren't absent, you were aligning with God. You weren't sulking, you were strategizing. You didn't collapse, you rose from within. And now everything they thought they could control is out of their reach. They're no longer laughing, they're no longer bold. Why? Because the one they tried to bury has returned, not in the same form, not with the same energy, but transformed. And what's worse for them, you were awake the whole time. You saw the fake smiles, you heard the gossip, you felt the subtle digs and the smug glances pass between them like inside jokes. And you didn't react. You recorded, you didn't defend, you discerned, you didn't lash out, you let God prepare the table. Think about Rosa Parks. They thought she was just a tired seamstress who didn't know the rules. But she wasn't confused. She was courageous. Her silence on that bus wasn't surrender. It was a shift in spiritual history. And from one quiet act of resistance, an entire civil rights movement roared to life. That's the power of someone who knows when to act, not for applause, but for alignment. What if the stillness they mocked was the very space where you found your wings? They were betting on your breakdown. That was the plan, wasn't it? Keep pushing, keep poking, keep twisting the knife. Hope you'd snap. Hope you'd retaliate in a way that made you look crazy. Hope you'd confirm the lies they told to justify their mistreatment. But instead of combusting, you concentrated. You didn't shatter. You shed. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done. Genesis 50:20. You didn't waste the fire. You let it refine you. You learned who was real, who could hold your light, and who only wanted to drain it. While they were laughing at your absence, you were learning their patterns. You were discovering your voice. You were developing a clarity they couldn't handle. Consider Keanu Reeves, quiet, calm, and often misunderstood. For years he was underestimated, but he never explained himself. He observed. He endured loss, rejection, and ridicule, and through it all, he built a reputation for integrity, kindness, and depth. He didn't chase noise. He embodied quiet excellence. And now, the world honors the very presence they once overlooked. Have you noticed how the same rooms where your silence made them feel superior are now haunted by your absence? They flinch now. They second-guess their words. They watch what they say in places where they once twisted your name without hesitation. They laugh less. Why? Because deep down they realize they lost access to something sacred. And they can't recreate what you brought. Your presence wasn't just company, it was conviction. It forced people to face themselves. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John 1:5. And now that you've emerged, they're face to face with someone they no longer recognize. You shed the version of yourself they abused. You burned off the parts of you that made them comfortable. You stepped out of the smallness they forced you into. And now they're panicking. Think of Frida Kahlo. During her hardest seasons, she was mocked for her pain, misunderstood in her vision, and ignored by her peers. But in the silence of her struggle, she created. She evolved. And now her legacy is immortal. Her art is a language the world now celebrates. Her pain wasn't the end of her. It was the revelation of her depth. Just like your silence wasn't your grave, it was your growth. What happens when the version of you they tried to destroy becomes the proof that they never really knew you at all? They don't know whether to apologize or retreat. They don't know how to face the new you, the one who doesn't need their validation, doesn't flinch at their games, and doesn't play dumb anymore. They mocked the observer. Now, they're obsessed with the awakened one. The same eyes they dismissed now see too much. The same energy they laughed at now walks in power they can't touch. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. Isaiah 61. Let this sink in. You didn't rise for applause. You rose because the silence was over. You rose because your cocoon cracked open. You rose because the calling on your life demanded it. And now, they finally understand. The version of you they laughed at is gone. The version of you they begged to stay small, stay quiet, stay compliant, that version has been buried. You didn't change to get revenge. You transformed to fulfill your purpose. Look at J.K. Rowling, rejected by multiple publishers, broke, depressed, laughed at. But in her quiet season, she wrote. And that season gave birth to the Harry Potter series, the most successful book franchise in history. Her silence was her rebuilding. Her awakening became their reckoning. What is more terrifying to your enemies than seeing the one they tried to erase rise without bitterness, but with brilliance? Let them beg. Let them stutter. Let them remember every whisper spoken while you were in the dark. Because now the light is on, and in this light they can't hide anymore. You've outgrown their narrative. You've escaped the role they cast for you. You are not the same. You are not coming back. This is your moment to own your truth, to walk in it boldly. You were never the one out of place. You were just surrounded by people who couldn't handle real. They couldn't control it, couldn't manipulate it. So they tried to destroy it. But instead of falling apart, you fell inward and found God, clarity and power. Now they stand in front of you speechless, not because you're loud, but because you're solid. You don't have to yell. Your life is loud enough. You don't have to explain. Your results already testify. You don't have to forgive them in person. God already flipped the script. So let this be your reminder. The awakening is the vengeance. Your silence was never weakness, it was warfare. Your stillness wasn't surrender, it was sacred. And now, chosen one, the same people who once fed off your pain are starving for your presence, but you're not serving it anymore. Number 3, they misread your peace as permission. Now their panic is personal. Chosen one, they mistook your peace for permission. Isn't that always how it starts? You extended calm and they interpreted it as consent. You stayed composed and they convinced themselves it meant compliance. They assumed your stillness was weakness, your patience was submission, your distance was defeat. But what happens when the peace they played with was never theirs to begin with? What if your presence was the only thing keeping the chaos at bay? While they were busy convincing themselves that your silence meant surrender, you were letting them expose themselves in full daylight. You weren't afraid to speak. You were discerning when to. You weren't too small to matter. You were too grounded to waste your breath. You were never backing down. You were backing off so that the illusion could collapse under its own weight. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus 14:14. Stillness isn't a retreat for the chosen, it's a positioning. You were letting the storm gather. You were giving the stage enough time to reveal its cracks. You weren't passive, you were patient. And now the tremors are shaking everything they tried to build on the shaky ground of your stillness. Have you ever noticed how quickly people become afraid when they realize they're no longer being tolerated, just observed? They misread the assignment. You didn't allow their behavior because you were okay with it. You tolerated it because you were testing it. While they took your grace as permission, you were watching their masks melt. You were watching them build illusions on sand, never realizing that the quake had already started deep within your spirit. Take a moment to think about Serena Williams, calm, focused, poised, even when attacked publicly for her appearance, her attitude, her strength. Many mistook her grace under pressure as docility, but when she moved with power. She didn't retaliate in interviews. She answered with trophies. Her peace wasn't passivity, it was poise with precision. How many times have they mistaken your restraint as weakness, only to find themselves unprepared for your transformation? They weaponized your kindness, abused your energy, and stretched your silence until it turned into strategy. You weren't absent, you were aligning. You weren't broken, you were becoming. And now the shift has happened. You've moved, you didn't scream, you didn't warn, you just evolved, and that's what terrifies them most. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. James 3:18. You were the peacemaker in a room full of chaos addicts. You were the emotional anchor while they stirred drama. And when you left, their dysfunction had nothing to cling to. Your absence is now louder than any argument you could have made. The room they used to dominate with false confidence has turned on them. Your stillness used to cover them. Now it convicts them. You didn't just leave the conversation, you removed the climate that made their lies feel livable. Think about Maya Angelou. She never shouted to be heard. She stood tall in stillness, and the world leaned in to listen. They tried to mislabel her grace as weakness, but her truth echoed through generations. That's the power of presence without panic. Just like you, she didn't have to retaliate. She simply had to remain aligned with truth. Have you realized yet that their false confidence was never rooted in power? It was in your patience. Their superiority was an illusion stabilized by your silence. The moment you withdrew your energy, their empire cracked, their smiles faded, Their stories collapsed under the weight of unbalanced truth. And now they're panicking. Why? Because the one thing that kept their lies together has stepped out and taken all the grace with it. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that will he also reap. Galatians 6:7. You gave them mercy, you gave them clarity, and for a while you gave them peace. But they sowed manipulation into the ground you sanctified, and now the harvest has arrived. Not because you sent it, but because truth doesn't stay hidden forever. It always returns with consequences. Let's be honest, they were never scared of your words. They were scared of your clarity. They were afraid of the day you'd finally see the game for what it was and stop participating. That day came. And when it did, their script unraveled. They relied on your understanding, even while they mistreated you. They expected you to keep explaining yourself while they kept spinning lies. But now you're silent, for real, not out of fear, but from fullness. Do you remember Bruce Lee's iconic discipline? He spoke softly, but when he moved, the world shook. He didn't fight every battle. He chose his ground, and when he struck, it was precise. He said, "Be like water." You, chosen one, were like water, fluid, quiet, adapting, and now you're the flood they can't hold back. How do they recover from losing access to the very peace they pretended they didn't need? Your presence wasn't just a benefit, it was the structure, the stabilizing energy, the covering. You were the silent order beneath their chaos, and now that you've withdrawn, they're exposed, raw, unraveling, and without cover. You didn't burn their world down, you simply stopped carrying it. You refused to be the emotional crutch that propped up their dysfunction, and that's what's igniting the fire. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:10. You were persecuted quietly, dismissed subtly, mocked gently, but your righteousness was never for show, it was structural. You were holding up rooms spiritually while being overlooked emotionally, and now the divine balance has returned. Your withdrawal wasn't punishment, it was positioning. It was heaven restoring order. Look at Beyoncé. Often criticized early in her solo career, they called her robotic, distant, overrated. She didn't respond with interviews, she responded with excellence. Her silence turned into visual albums, global performances, and legacy. She didn't fight for the spotlight, she simply became undeniable. Her peace wasn't weakness, it was work being done in silence. Let's make this plain. You didn't shrink. You recalibrated. You weren't silent because you were scared. You were silent because you were sovereign. You were holding sacred space within yourself. And now that you've reclaimed that peace, their panic has become deeply personal. They can't blame you anymore. They can't scapegoat you. They can't play victim to the absence of something they used to manipulate. They feel the shift. They hear the silence, and it's deafening. They sense your distance, and it's not just physical, it's spiritual. The energy has changed. The roles have reversed. And you're no longer available to be the balm for their brokenness. Let this settle in your spirit. Your peace was never a favor. It was power. It was the quiet force that kept the system from collapsing. It was the unseen hand that kept the temperature from boiling over. And now that it's been removed, everything built on the illusion of your consent is crumbling. You were the only real source of balance they had, and now they're exposed to the chaos they tried to hide behind your calm. So let them panic, let them sweat in the silence, let them feel the chill of your absence, because now they understand the peace they abused was never passive, it was you. And you, chosen one, have finally taken it back. Number 4, you played powerless, so they dropped their guard. Chosen one, you didn't raise your voice. You didn't clap back. You didn't go into battle swinging your arms wild. And yet, look around. Their empire is falling. Their alliances are crumbling. Their confidence is cracking. Why? Because while they were showing off, you were showing restraint. While they were broadcasting power, you were mastering precision. And now, the one they overlooked has become the force they can't stop talking about. They never saw you coming, but it wasn't because you were hidden. It's because you made a divine decision to appear smaller than you are for a time. You dimmed your light. You shrank yourself. You withdrew your energy. Not because you lacked awareness, but because you were watching the field, testing the current, measuring the integrity of every connection. How often have you stepped into a room knowing you could dominate it, but chose not to, just to see who assumed they had the upper hand? That's exactly what happened. You gave them comfort. You let them believe the false narrative they whispered to others, that you were naive, oblivious, too emotional, too small. You let them build their confidence on your quiet, their plans on your patience. But what they failed to realize is that you weren't powerless. You were in position. Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. Proverbs 16:32. Patience is not weakness. In the kingdom, it's weaponry. You crouched, not to cower, but to gain leverage. You stayed low, not because you were lost, but because you were gathering strength, gaining vision, preparing your moment. And while they flaunted their schemes like they were untouchable, they never noticed the trap they set was for themselves. Look at Nelson Mandela. They imprisoned him, silenced him, mocked him. But his silence wasn't surrender, it was strength. They thought they broke him, but he was building power in isolation. When he emerged, he didn't return bitter. He returned as a president. His silence was never powerlessness, it was preparation. How many people revealed their true selves because they believed you had no power to expose them? That's where the beauty lies. They took your stillness as stupidity, your quiet as confusion, your soft demeanor as vulnerability. But the truth? You were never confused. You were letting their masks slip on their own. You didn't chase them down. You didn't fight to be heard. You let them tell on themselves, and they did. And now that the shift has come, your silence has become a mirror, one they can't look into without seeing the truth, one they can't escape because it's their reflection that haunts them, not yours. Your evolution didn't require revenge, it required removal. The moment you stopped shrinking to fit the version they needed you to be, everything shifted. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Psalm 118, verse 22. You were rejected, misjudged, treated like the least significant voice in the room, but the very silence they despised has become the truth they can't ignore. Your presence now speaks what your mouth never had to say. The same rooms they once invited you to mock you. Those rooms feel cold without your energy anchoring them. You used to balance the chaos. Now they're spiraling without you. Consider Chadwick Boseman, quiet, humble, powerful. He carried terminal illness while shooting films that inspired the world. No pity, no complaints, just excellence. He played roles of kings and heroes while fighting an unseen battle. And when the world finally saw what he was enduring all along, their jaws dropped. His silence wasn't weakness, it was legacy being built in secret, just like you. When did we start believing that power has to be loud to be real? The chosen ones know the opposite is true. Real power doesn't need applause. It doesn't seek validation. It simply stands. You never had to retaliate. You never had to prove your worth. All you had to do was stop pretending to be less than who you really are. And the moment you stood tall, the whole environment shifted. And that's what broke them. That's what has them unraveling in silence. You didn't scream. You didn't expose them in public. You simply stopped playing along. And your refusal to shrink shook the stage they built around your supposed smallness. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. Isaiah 40:31. You waited, not passively, but faithfully, not timidly, but with eyes wide open, and now you are rising with strength they didn't see coming. They thought you'd stay in the valley, but you were only crouching for takeoff. They assumed the silence meant the storm was over, but the storm was never outside. It was you, building, evolving, becoming. Let's talk truth. Their entire strategy relied on one fatal assumption: that you didn't know, that you weren't watching, that you were too soft to notice. And that was their mistake. Because every fake smile, every knife behind the back, every whispered lie, you logged it. You didn't react because your spirit was taking inventory. And when the time came to move, you did so with unshakable clarity. Think of Michael Jordan, cut from his high school basketball team. They said he wasn't good enough. He didn't argue. He trained. He didn't fight the narrative. He rewrote it with championships. His silence on the bench wasn't the end. It was the prelude to a dynasty. Your silence wasn't the end. It was the edge of your acceleration. What happens when the one they counted out becomes the one carrying the crown? They built their boldness on the idea that you would stay down, that you would never speak, that you would never shift. But now their strategy has turned against them. You didn't ruin them. You didn't sabotage anything. You simply stopped shrinking, and their illusion couldn't survive in the presence of your full self. Your glow became their unraveling, your clarity, their confusion, your boundaries, their breakdown. And now, they don't know how to operate around you anymore. The version of you they used to manipulate has vanished. The person they played mind games with is gone. What remains is someone they can't predict, can't bend, can't shame. They're standing in front of a you they never expected, and it's terrifying them. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Joshua 1:9. Your strength is no longer silent. It's visible. It radiates in every room you walk into. Not loud, not arrogant, but undeniable. You don't beg for understanding. You no longer explain your presence. You simply arrive, and your presence tells the story. Let this be your confirmation. You didn't lose power. You learned how to contain it. You didn't step back because you were weak. You stepped back because you were strategic. You chose when and how to rise. And now that you've stood, there's not a lie left in the world strong enough to hold you down. They should have played fair. They should have guarded their lies better. But instead, they gambled against the one who was always watching, always listening, always aware. And now that you're done playing powerless, the spotlight isn't on your performance, it's on their exposure. So let them panic, let them explain to themselves how they missed the signs. Let them wonder how the one they tried to bury is now standing in light too powerful to ignore. Because chosen one, you didn't have to scream, you just had to stand. And now every false narrative is crashing under the gravity of your truth. Number 5. Now that you've stopped pretending, their reality is collapsing. Chosen one, there was a time when you stayed quiet, not because you didn't see what was happening, but because you were still measuring the room. You pretended to be unaware. You let them believe you were clueless, harmless, irrelevant. You wore invisibility like armor. You made yourself small, not because you lacked power, but because you knew the second you showed it, everything would change. They leaned on your silence like it was a crutch. They built their kingdom on the illusion that you would never wake up. But what happens when the one holding up the whole system finally steps away? Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Ephesians 5:14. You woke up, and that changed everything. You stopped pretending not to notice the lies, the manipulation, the subtle digs disguised as jokes. You stopped carrying burdens that were never yours to begin with. And the moment you stood in your clarity, their entire structure began to collapse. not because you attacked it, but because you stopped sustaining it. How many people have built their sense of superiority on the assumption that you would never speak, never rise, never shift? They fed off your restraint. They confused your boundaries with permission. They took your silence as consent and built fake narratives that only stood because you hadn't corrected the record. But you weren't dumb. You were divine. You were the glue that held the dysfunction in place, the peacekeeper who absorbed the chaos so the whole structure wouldn't collapse. But now the sponge is dry. Now the buffer is gone, and the system they weaponized is devouring itself. Think of Britney Spears. For over a decade she was painted as unstable, unfit, voiceless. Her silence was turned into proof of guilt, but when she broke her silence, the world saw the truth. The empire built on controlling her cracked wide open. She didn't have to scream, she simply had to speak, and the illusion died in public. That's the power of awakening. You didn't destroy anything, you just refused to hold it together any longer. You stopped pretending not to notice. You stopped cushioning their downfall with your energy. And now they're limping through karma, unsure how to function without the peace they took for granted. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. What they called overreacting was really your intuition. What they mocked as sensitivity was actually your discernment. They underestimated the one person who could see straight through the game, and now they're terrified that others are beginning to see it too. Because your clarity is contagious, you used to walk in rooms and swallow your insight to keep the peace. Now you walk in as your full self, and people feel it before you even speak. You used to hold your tongue to keep them comfortable. Now your presence alone unravels their stories. The room once ruled by illusion is now being rearranged by your alignment. Have you noticed how the same people who once dismissed you now flinch in your presence? They thought your absence would make them powerful. They didn't realize your absence would remove the very thing that made the structure stable. They built their confidence on borrowed strength, yours. They thrived while you were minimizing yourself. But now that you've returned with eyes wide open, they can't fake it anymore. Remember Malala Yousafzai? They tried to silence her with violence. She was just a young girl with a dream for education. But the moment she chose truth over fear, her voice became global. Her presence exposed injustice without lifting a weapon. Her clarity dismantled decades of control. That's the impact of someone who stops pretending. How much of their confidence was fueled by your silence? How much of their power was propped up by your patience? They never really had peace. You were their peace. They never had control. You were the atmosphere. Their influence, borrowed. Their confidence, manufactured. Their success, dependent on you playing small. And the moment you stopped, truly stopped, the fantasy ended. They don't fear exposure. They fear your clarity. Because now everyone else is seeing what you've known all along. The cracks are visible. The illusions are unraveling, and they can't contain it anymore. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. You were once the crushed in spirit, the one holding back tears just to keep the illusion of peace. You took the hits. You made room for their dysfunction. You stayed soft while they stayed selfish. But not anymore. Now your strength is unmistakable. Now your boundaries are unshakable. Now your awareness is the sword that separates fact from facade. Think of Anthony Bourdain, deep, reflective, often misunderstood. He walked through cultures quietly, respectfully, with clarity and presence. He didn't dominate a room, but he transformed it. And when he passed, the world suddenly realized just how much light he brought, how much balance he carried. That's who you are. The balance no one admitted they needed until it was gone. What happens when the one they tried to erase becomes the center of gravity they can't replace? They're scrambling now. Not because you did anything to them, but because you stopped doing everything for them. You stopped playing the fool, You stopped making yourself small so others could feel tall. You stopped muting your voice so liars could feel safe. And now the room feels different because you're no longer absorbing their chaos. You're no longer cushioning their fall. You're not fixing the narrative. You're not holding it together. And they know you were the one who made it all function, not because you were loud, but because your stillness was sacred. Your energy was anchoring. And now it's gone. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Matthew 5:16. Your light is not loud, but it's undeniable. It exposes what needs to be seen. It uplifts what was meant to rise. And it burns through every lie that depended on your silence to survive. You didn't have to announce anything, you just had to awaken. And your awakening has become their unraveling. So let them panic. Let them try to patch the cracks with fake apologies. Let them run from the truth they spent years ignoring. You don't need to chase them. You don't need to explain a thing. Because now that you've stopped pretending, the truth is speaking for itself. You're not doing anything except being fully, unapologetically you. And that alone is tearing down the illusion they thought would never break. The scary part? You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're just done. Done pretending you didn't see what was done to you. Done pretending you didn't feel the manipulation. Done pretending that your presence wasn't the thread holding the whole system together. Now they're left to face the wreckage. And you're walking forward, glowing, grounded, and gloriously untouchable. Because, chosen one, their world didn't fall apart because you fought it. It fell apart because you stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. Number 6. Chosen one. Stop apologizing for the light that scares them. Chosen one. How many times have you swallowed your brilliance to make other people feel safe? How many moments have you hesitated before speaking, not because you didn't know the truth, but because you knew others weren't ready to hear it? How many times have you dimmed your light, not because it wasn't bright enough, but because it was too bright for people still hiding in shadows? You've been told you're too much, too intense, too emotional, too awake. But here's the real question. Too much for who? And why were you ever trying to fit inside a box that God never designed for you in the first place? You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Matthew 5:14. Your glow isn't arrogance, it's assignment. Your presence isn't decoration, it's disruption. You were designed to confront, to awaken, to shift the atmosphere just by walking into a room. But somewhere along the journey, you started apologizing for that. You started shrinking, silencing, second-guessing, not because you doubted your power, but because they couldn't handle it. They weren't afraid of your anger. They weren't terrified of your intensity. What shook them was your awakening, your clarity, your mirror. Because when you walk in with truth in your eyes, it reflects everything they've been running from in themselves. Have you ever realized they weren't reacting to your personality? They were reacting to your presence. You stood in alignment and their illusions trembled. You spoke with discernment and their performances unraveled. You didn't accuse anyone. You simply existed with awareness. And that alone was enough to rattle the lies they clung to. Think of Robin Williams, a man who lit up every space he entered, made millions laugh, but behind that joy was depth, insight, and spiritual pain that few could handle. His light was powerful, but it scared those who couldn't match it. He wasn't too much. He was too real, just like you. People didn't push back because you were loud. They pushed back because you were accurate. You called out dysfunction without speaking. You exposed deception without accusation. Your frequency didn't attack. It revealed. And they couldn't manipulate someone who wasn't buying the illusion. So they labeled you difficult, sensitive, dramatic, too deep, too serious. Why? Because the easiest way to dismiss a mirror is to blame the reflection. They didn't hate your truth. They hated what your truth forced them to see in themselves. For everything that is hidden will eventually be brought into the open, and every secret will be brought to light. Mark 4:22. You became the revealer of what they worked so hard to bury, and in their eyes that made you dangerous, not because you were cruel, but because you refused to play dumb. You refused to dilute your insight. You refused to settle for half light when you were built to blaze like the sun. How many times have you gaslit yourself just to protect someone else's illusion? Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm being too intense. Maybe I really am the problem. That wasn't humility. That was survival in an environment allergic to truth. You weren't the issue. You were the interruption, the divine disturbance, the prophetic presence that made them uncomfortable. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you did everything right. Consider Prince, the legendary musician who was unapologetically himself in a world that tried to demand conformity. He wore what he wanted, said what he meant, created what his spirit downloaded. People called him strange, but deep down they knew he was a force. He didn't tone it down. He didn't ask for permission to shine. He knew his light wasn't for everyone, and neither is yours. Chosen one, you've been playing it safe for too long, walking on eggshells to keep fragile egos from cracking, smiling through disrespect, nodding through dishonesty, softening your truth like it was a sin to see clearly. But let's get something straight. Your light is not a problem. Their shadows are. You're not too emotional. You're emotionally intelligent. You're not too sensitive. You're spiritually perceptive. You're not too much. You're just on time, and they're the ones behind schedule. Do not quench the spirit. Do not despise prophetic utterances. 1 Thessalonians 5:19-20. You've been carrying a prophetic edge, one that sees through the performance, and instead of embracing it, you've been apologizing for it. But enough is enough. It's time to stop pretending. Stop softening. Stop twisting yourself to fit inside spaces you were meant to transform. Do you remember Harriet Tubman? She was told she was crazy, a threat, dangerous, all because she had vision and courage. She didn't need approval. She didn't wait for permission. She followed the light within her, and it led hundreds out of slavery. That's the power of someone who knows their purpose and refuses to apologize for it. So let's break the cycle right now. You are not intimidating, you are illuminating. And people who have hidden in darkness for too long will always be terrified of the first person who walks in holding fire. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. Isaiah 61. You don't owe anyone an apology for your clarity, your discernment, your frequency. You're not arrogant for knowing who you are. You're not cold for protecting your peace. You're not the villain in the story. They just needed you to play that role so they wouldn't have to confront their own character. And now that you've stopped playing small, they can't handle it. You used to hold your tongue, and they called you confused. Now you speak, and they call you dangerous. But what's really happening is they can't rewrite the story anymore, because you finally picked up the pen. Have you noticed how uncomfortable people get when you start living as the version of yourself they secretly feared all along? That version of you who knows, sees, discerns, and refuses to flinch, that's the you they hoped would never show up. That's the version they can't control, can't label, can't silence. And the best part, you don't need to convince anyone. Your glow speaks for itself. You don't need to scream to be heard. You walk into spaces and the energy shifts. You aren't a presence, you are a signal, and they feel it before you say a word. You're not here to fit in. You're here to wake people up. You're not here to keep things comfortable. You're here to move frequencies, to disturb patterns, to make souls confront their own delay. Let them call it too much, too bold, too fast, but don't you dare apologize again. They don't hate you. They hate the mirror you hold. And you, chosen one, you were never too much. You were just ahead of schedule. Number 7. The same ones who mocked you are studying you in secret. Chosen one, isn't it strange how quiet the laughter gets once you rise? The same voices that once ridiculed your every step are now whispering in the shadows, trying to figure out how you got here. The same people who once called your faith delusional now scroll through your timeline like it's a sacred text. They mocked your journey. Now they monitor your glow. They dismissed your struggle. Now they dissect your survival. They once taught arrogance, but now they study your endurance like their next breath depends on it. How does it feel to know the ones who called you crazy are now quoting your calm? They didn't expect this. They thought the pressure would crush you. They assumed the silence would shatter you. They were convinced the isolation would drive you mad. But instead of breaking, you built. Instead of folding, you focused. And instead of losing your mind, you found your mission. You didn't just survive the darkness, you decoded it. You didn't escape the fire, you transformed in it. And now, every move you make haunts them. Not because you're loud, but because you're undeniable. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Psalm 118 verse 22. They rejected you, ridiculed you, rewrote your story into a version they could control. But the same people who once swore they were above you are now tracing the very footsteps they used to mock. Not because they've changed their hearts, but because life humbled them enough to recognize your light as a blueprint. Think of Stephen King. At the start of his career, his manuscript for Carrie was rejected dozens of times. He threw it in the trash. His wife dug it out. The very publishers who once said he wasn't good enough. They later chased his work like it was gold. Now he's one of the most studied authors in the world. What changed? Not him. The perception, the outcome, the truth. Just like you, chosen one. The people who once saw no value in your voice now replay your words with surgical focus. They analyze your tone. They emulate your rituals. They mimic your clarity, all without giving credit. Because to acknowledge your influence would require admitting their failure to see it in the first place. How many people have secretly turned your authenticity into their survival manual, while still pretending to be above you? They didn't just doubt you, they depended on your silence. Their strategy was always to define you before you defined yourself. If they could convince the room that you were too deep, too intense, too emotional, then they wouldn't have to deal with the truth your presence made impossible to ignore. But you didn't play along. You didn't fight back with their weapons. You didn't compete with their noise. You became the most dangerous kind of influence, consistent, silent, and spiritually aligned. They tried to write you out of the story. And now their next chapter sounds suspiciously like yours. Let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you. Proverbs 4:25. You weren't watching them, but they've been watching you. Your focus terrified them. Your boundaries confused them. Your peace challenged them. Because while they were performing for applause, you were undergoing inner resurrection. And now that you've come out on the other side, glowing, grounded and clear, they're not laughing anymore. They're studying. Think of Megan Rapinoe, once mocked for her unapologetic boldness, activism and unfiltered truth. But over time, her resilience reshaped the conversation. Now even critics quote her words, trace her steps, study her style. She didn't shift for the crowd. She stayed true to her core, and the crowd eventually followed. You see, chosen one, you are the reference point, the code breaker, the map they ignored until the wilderness got too loud. They don't respect your path publicly, but privately it's their salvation. You were once too much. Now you're the manual for how to rise. But as for you, be strong and do not give up, for your work will be rewarded. 2 Chronicles 15:7. You didn't ask for the spotlight. You didn't post your pain for sympathy. You didn't chase platforms. You built in silence. You bled in the dark. You prayed in the wilderness. And now, your very presence is doing what your words never needed to. It's proving every lie they told about you wrong. They said you were trying too hard, that you were forcing something, that you were chasing ghosts. But now they're chasing you. Quietly, carefully. They study your habits, your language, your strategy, trying to recreate results they never earned. And here's the truth they won't admit. You became what they feared, proof that it's possible to ascend without conforming. Think of Franz Kafka, whose work was dismissed and unpublished in his lifetime. He died in obscurity. But today, his writings are taught in universities, quoted by philosophers, and imitated by entire genres of literature. They weren't ready for his voice when he was alive, but they couldn't erase it after he was gone. That's the power of timeless clarity. Have you noticed they can mimic your methods but never match your results? They try to mirror your energy, replicate your cadence, copy your confidence, but it doesn't stick. Why? Because your movement was never about performance. It was birthed from purpose. It was carved from pain. You didn't learn alignment in a classroom, you earned it in the fire. And that's the part they'll never be able to copy. Your scars, your tears, your dark nights where you faced yourself and chose to heal instead of hate. That's the depth they lack. That's the peace they can't plagiarize. No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. Isaiah 54:17. They tried to discredit you before you could bloom, but you kept rising. They tried to smear your name before you had a chance to shine, but your character was too clean. They expected you to react, to scream, to fight, to fall. Instead, you stayed still and let the truth build its own platform. Now, every room where your name is mentioned comes with a pause, a reckoning, a reconsideration, because energy never lies, and no matter how they try to distort your story, they can't duplicate your spirit. So, let them watch, let them mimic, let them rewrite their memory to soothe their guilt. But know this, you were never behind. You were becoming. You're not their competition, you're their curriculum. You didn't rise by chance. You rose because you were chosen. You rose because you endured. You rose because when the noise got too loud, you turned inward instead of outward. And now they can't stop looking because you became the blueprint they swore didn't exist. Beloved, you didn't do any of this for revenge. You didn't rise for applause. You didn't awaken to prove anyone wrong. You rose because your spirit refused to stay asleep. You transformed because your soul could no longer breathe in the smallness they tried to confine you to. While they were performing, you were evolving, and now they can't stop watching, not because they suddenly admire you, but because your presence reveals everything they chose to avoid. You are the living evidence of what it looks like when someone walks through the fire and doesn't come out burned, but blazing. You reflect the price they weren't willing to pay, the internal war they ran from, and the calling they abandoned. And now that you've made it, they're secretly trying to decode the path they once mocked, quietly copying the steps they once ridiculed. Because your journey, chosen one, wasn't built in spotlight. It was built in silence. What you carry cannot be imitated because it was forged in pain, in prayer, and in spiritual precision. You are the lesson they never wanted to learn. The example they tried to erase has become the reference they now secretly rely on. The same ones who rolled their eyes at your stillness are now reading your movements like a map. You didn't scream to be seen. You didn't beg to be heard. You simply aligned. And that alignment began to speak louder than anything they ever said about you. Let them study. Let them scramble. Let them try to replicate something they never had the strength to survive. Because while they were building with ego, you were rising in authenticity. While they were addicted to image, you were anchoring in truth. And now the fruit is showing. Now your presence speaks volumes without a single word. You are no longer the one trying to fit in. You are the one they can't stop referencing, even if they can't say it out loud. And now that we've come full circle, the one they dismissed has become the one they depend on for direction. The voice they tried to silence now echoes through the very spaces they once used to exclude you. You didn't chase revenge. You didn't beg for recognition. You became the reminder, and your presence has become the confrontation they can't outrun. So walk tall, chosen one. Let them watch. Let them overanalyze. Let them keep attending the class they never thought they'd enroll in, taught by the very one they tried to destroy. You are proof that resilience is spiritual. You are proof that survival is sacred. And you are walking through life with an authority that was earned, not handed to you. If this message spoke to something real in your spirit, if it confirmed what you've been silently carrying, I invite you to share it with someone who needs the reminder that pretending is over and alignment is louder than noise. And if you feel led to support this message through super thanks, know that it's deeply appreciated. Whether you choose to donate or not, I'm already grateful that you've stayed, listened, and walked this road alongside me. Your presence means more than words can say. I bless your steps. I bless your strength. I bless the way you've risen from places that were meant to break you. And I declare that what's ahead of you will not just reward your endurance, it will silence every voice that ever doubted your calling. Keep shining, keep speaking, keep standing in the knowing of who you are. You didn't survive by accident, you were chosen to rise. And now, chosen one, your time is now.